Hey guys, I'm often asked by people, where did you learn all this stuff? And the answer is now on my website. I have spent years exploring the topics you see on my channel, and I am creating an apologetics course that links to videos, articles, and books that have most influenced me. In this course, you will hear brilliant minds from our modern era, as well as luminaries of the past, as they explore deep and important questions. Without a doubt, the ideas in this course have changed my life and deepened my faith. And that's why I want to share them with you. So please go check it out. Visit thoughtfulfaith.org and then click on the Apologetics course and start your journey today.
And then real quick, I don't really hold to like the old concept of inerrancy. I'm perfectly fine saying there are, scribal errors in the text. Like I've been kind of on the same page. It's just highly reliable.
And so because we don't have the originals, the text that we have today in our modern Bibles, not to use a Latter-day Saint phrase on you, but it is correct insofar, or the Bible is true insofar it has been translated correctly. Is that similar to your position? I don't want to put you on the spot.
I have to think about it.
Can we really trust the Bible? Bart Urman is an ex-evangelical biblical scholar who specializes in eroding Christian confidence in the reliability of the Bible. And while I believe that Bart has an occasional good point when it comes to biblical inerrancy, what are we to make of his claim about the Bible not being reliable? To explore that question, I decided to bring on my friend Michael Jones from Inspiring Philosophy. And yes, I know Michael has made videos critical of Latter-day Saint beliefs. But to be fair, I've made many videos critical of his worldview as well. I actually got to meet Michael at Ruslan's Bless God conference this spring. And despite his notoriously grumpy exterior demeanor online and even in person, it doesn't take long in chatting with him to realize he's a devout believer in Jesus Christ, a serious thinker, and a very good man. Michael's video series on New Testament reliability was a game changer for me as I wrestled with questions that people like Bart Urman have brought up. Also, his videos on atheism and some of the latest findings in science are some of the most mind-blowing I have ever watched. In fact, they were so good I included many of them in my apologetics course on my website. The bottom line is that Bart Urman is wrong about a whole bunch of things, and by the end of this video, you'll see what I mean. Michael Jones, welcome to Thoughtful Faith. How are you doing today?
Doing good. Thanks for having me.
Hey, we're just going to jump right into this. So I want to ask you, what are the Gospels and why were they written?
Yeah, so the Gospels are, most scholars would say, are Greco-Roman biographies, and that they are trying to tell the life of an historical figure. And so they were probably used to help teach Christians about the story and the life of Jesus. They are probably used for evangelizing. They were probably used for a whole host of different things. But being that they're Greco-Roman biographies, or they at least fit generally into that genre, that was a genre that aimed to capture historical information about a person. So they were not trying to craft fiction. They were not trying to just get all the hearsay. If you're writing a biography about somebody in the ancient world, your aim was to give your audience the most accurate information about them as possible. So because that's the genre they were writing in, it does tell us at least that the authors were interested in who the historical Jesus was. And it tells us they were trying to give us as much accurate information as they thought they could give. Now, that doesn't mean they were successful. We have to look at other evidences for that, but that's generally what the purpose of a biography would have been.
Yeah, and so one thing is, and obviously we're going to be dealing a little bit with Bart Urman today, because you and Bart Urman obviously have very different opinions about maybe not in what the Gospels are exactly, but definitely when it gets into some of the details on some of those things. Now, have you ever interviewed Bart? I can't remember if you ever interacted with Bart directly?
I had him once on my channel. He was promoting a debate with Mike Lacona that was like 8 hours long, and I interviewed him on the Book of Revelation specifically. So I've not had the chance to talk to him about this specific topic.
Okay, very cool. Well, I wanna play some clips from Bart, and then I'll preface it with this. The reason I'm bringing up Bart Urman is there's a lot of Latter-day Saints out there that are sort of find Bart Urman to be someone compelling who makes really good arguments, and especially and I'm a little concerned by that, but I want to hear out what he has to say and kind of get your thoughts on it. So I want to pull up a clip here. Let me get this on the screen of Bart talking about sort of the authorship of the Gospels. So I'm going to go ahead and share. Let me see here. This one right here. And then let's listen. And I want you to feel free to stop me as we're doing this if you want to comment on something he's saying that you find particularly problematic.
As I studied more and more using my intelligence as an evangelical, but also praying about it, I became convinced that the New Testament Gospels were not written by eyewitnesses or by people who knew eyewitnesses. The first point to make is the rather obvious one that the Gospels don't claim to be written by eyewitnesses. They are all anonymous.
Okay,
Gospel, according to Matthew and so forth, were added by later editors.
Go ahead and pause it. So, I mean, for one thing, that's just factually incorrect. The Gospel of John claims to be an eyewitness. And yet he said, he very clearly in chapter 21 and chapter 19, very clearly claims to be an eyewitness there. So that's just completely false. And Luke also claims to not be an eyewitness, but he claims to have gotten his information from eyewitnesses in the very first few verses of the Gospel of Luke. So, you don't have any explicit statements in Mark or Matthew, but they are in John and Luke. So that's kind of an odd argument for him to make. And to start this segment with I was studying with my intelligence, just really, I mean, don't break your arm patting yourself on the back there. I mean, it just doesn't really suggest somebody who's being humble here. I mean, that. I get that he wants to really drive home a point. I don't think it's intentional, but it just comes across as I was so smart and that's why I figured all this out. And that's why I believe what I do now. That's just, wow, that's something.
The condescending sort of atheist sort of look down your nose at anyone like I'm the one who actually thinks about these things, as if other people haven't seriously studied and looked at these, is a little bit much. But I agree. How is he making the claim that the Gospels don't claim to be written by eyewitnesses when, as you pointed out, the authors do claim that? So anyway, should we go on?
Yeah. Let's play a little bit more, then we can talk about the titles.
Okay, sounds good. Let's pull this up, and we'll continue.
Were not put there by the original authors. Second point, none of the Gospels claims to be written by the person whose name it bears. They don't claim to be written by eyewitnesses, and they don't claim to be written by people named Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Those are later traditions that were added to the Gospels. These traditions do not start appearing for about 100 years. Some people think that there is an early church father named Papias who attests to the witness of Mark and Matthew, but in fact there are very solid reasons for thinking that Papias, who lived around the year 120 to 140, is not referring to our Mark or our Matthew. The first time anybody refers to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John by name is Irenaeus in the year 180.
I can stop it there.
100 years.
Okay.
Yes. So we don't know who added the titles, but there is an interesting feature that some more conservative scholars will notice. They all have the same kind of title, like the Gospel according to Mark, the Gospel according to Matthew. And we don't really see that with other biographies. So it's an odd feature, and I've seen some scholars suggest that maybe Mark was the first one to use that title. Mm-hmm. Then it was just picked up by Luke and Matthew and then John. So if these were added later by different authors, why don't we see completely different types of titles? Now it is true the Gospels are internally anonymous. But Simon Gathercole has pointed out just about every biography from the ancient world was internally anonymous. That's how you wrote a biography. Like, he's found two that have names that are internally, and one of them is a fictional biography in the Historia Augusta, the life of Aelius. So it's like, okay, even if the names were in there, that doesn't mean they're factual or they're historical. Just so, I mean, like, this is an odd argument. I mean, this is just how you wrote a biography. The overwhelming majority never identify an author internally. And Simon Gathercole notes that's because there are other ways to identify a title or the author of a biography, like in a title, on a flyleaf, on a tag written on the outside of the scroll. But you didn't really identify yourself internally in the body when you were writing up a biography. This happens all the time. Like, Plutarch never identifies himself as the author of any of Plutarch's lives in them. So, odd argument there. Now, I brought up Papias, and he doesn't really cover it. And, I mean, here's the thing, though. Papias says that Matthew wrote the Logia, which may not be referring to the Gospel, could be referring to something like the Q source. But he also says Mark wrote stuff down for Peter. I don't see why that would not refer to the Gospel. I would like to see the actual arguments for that. But we do have another argument that actually works against Bart Urman, is that Justin Martyr says in his writings that he calls the Gospels constantly the memoirs of the apostles. But then at one point he says in the memoirs of Peter that this is where Jesus changed the sons of Zebedee to the sons of thunder. They changed their names. And we sort of go, well, where does that happen? Well, it only happens in the Gospel of Mark. So if they were making up titles, why didn't they just start attributing that one to Peter because of what Justin Martyr said? Why did they start attributing it to Mark? Well, I mean, it'd be much better to attribute it to an eyewitness instead of someone who just followed an eyewitness. So it seems far more likely that they were actually going on what the people who wrote them. Like, if you're not, you could. Why are you going to attribute the gospel to Mark, someone who never met Jesus, according to Papias? Why are you going to go? Why not just attribute it to Peter if you really want to put authenticity on this? And so, like, attributing two of the gospels, Mark and Luke, to two men who never met Jesus would be completely unlikely. They play extremely small roles throughout the New Testament. Paul only briefly mentions Luke at times. Mark is, again, briefly mentioned by Peter. It'd be extremely odd to attribute it to them. And we see the later Gnostic Gospels attributing their Gospels to people like Thomas and Judas and Mary. I mean, people that were much closer. So that's an issue there. And so then, of course, we get to the multiple attestation of this whole issue. I mean, there's no denying that we have unanimous attestation from all church fathers that the gospel authors are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And so, yeah, Irenaeus is probably the first, but the reason why he's the first is because there wasn't a reason to mention the gospel authors prior to that. What we know around that time is that there was a guy named Marcion who was a heretic, and he tried to sneak in an anonymous gospel that he made from mutilating Luke. So what did the church do? They went, what are you trying to do, Marcion? We don't hold to anonymous gospels. We've always held to the gospels that came from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So it makes sense for them to start mentioning the gospel authors when someone is trying to sneak in an anonymous gospel. Prior to that, they would have no reason to really bring them up in the limited sources that we have from that time. I mean, Justin Martyr, for example, may have mentioned them, but he was writing to mostly non-Christians in his apologies and his dialogue. They're not going to care or really need to know the names. They're not going to it's not going to be relevant for what he's writing on. So there's some issues there.
With Justin Martyr, what years was Justin again? I'm trying to remember because he's very, very early on.
Like around 150 AD. So not super much younger than Irenaeus, who's writing around 180.
Yeah, but
so
still,
I'm
still thinking that these are within lifetimes of people that would have been like the second generation of people after the original. I mean, some of those second generation people would have still been alive. I mean, if I'm even I'm thinking, if I want to know about something that was written in, I don't know, let's say 1860 or something like that, that's not that far away to be able to figure out who wrote this thing just through sort of oral traditions that would have existed. And I do wonder this, or I'd heard this, and I think you might have mentioned this in a video before, but it's sort of like a Wikipedia article. Like if I write a Wikipedia article, I don't put like, I, Jacob Hansen, am writing this Wikipedia article. And for
Yeah.
Latter-day Saints, a good analogy, in fact, what's funny is there's a manual that Latter-day Saint missionaries use called Preach My Gospel, which has all the lessons in it and the things that we teach. And there's no author mentioned in it. And my understanding of what the Gospels are, and you can correct me if you think differently, is that the Gospels were sort of like the original sort of missionary text that you had so that people who didn't know Jesus as they went out to preach would be able to have something written down that isn't just them making up what they heard, but is connected in some way to people that are more authoritative than just you. Is that kind of like using them in evangelization in some way? Is that the way that you would view the main purpose of the Gospels?
Yeah, they were definitely used for evangelizing and teaching about Jesus. They were used for training up Christians and evangelizing for sure. But I mean, it's just part of the genre. You don't say like, I, Matthew, am writing this, blah 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 blah. Like that's just not the way they would write in the ancient world. I don't even think they did it intentionally. I just think they knew that if you're going to write a biography about a sage or a prophet or somebody, you wrote anonymously. That's just how it was done. And so if they were going to say like, I, Matthew, da, 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 that would be too jarring for the audience. It wouldn't sound like an actual biography from the ancient world. And using the Wikipedia article is a good example. Like it'd be weird if we read a Wikipedia article like, Joe, am saying this about this topic. We'd be like, this is a forgery. This is not a real Wikipedia article. Like we get the same kind of concept there.
And it almost it's almost less authoritative when it's like,
exactly.
Oh, this is this guy's story rather than this is the official story.
Yeah, E.P. Sanders said something about that once. Yeah, it's very similar in that kind of setting. Is like if it's coming across as like their individual story, it does sound less authoritative.
Got it. Well, one other point that you made that I think is really interesting is why would they choose Luke and Mark as their like guys to be the authoritative sources? Like, wouldn't you have picked like Peter or I don't know, Thomas or one of the actual like apostles mentioned in the story as the person that is like, why would you attribute it to, oh yeah, he was a traveling companion of Paul who wasn't even one of the original 12. Like that's a weird name to pick if you're picking fake sources. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's an issue. And then also you have the issue of Hebrews. If they were just making up names for books, why didn't they make up a name for the book of Hebrews? Like attach an author to it. They debated about that. They didn't know. But you know what they did know? The authors were Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They disagreed about when the Gospels were written, in the order they were written in, who was present, where they were written. Like some say Mark was writing in Rome. Some say it was after he had left Rome. They weren't sure. They're contradicting on all these details. But the one detail they're always agreeing on is that the authors are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
So, and just to get the timeline straight. So, and we'll get into the timeline of like when the Gospels were actually written, because I think that's another interesting point that your videos, and I point everyone, go to Inspiring Philosophy and look up his New Testament reliability videos. They're excellent. But one of the points that you bring up, or just timeline wise, is, by Irenaeus, this is roughly 180. It's very clear. It's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That is the tradition. Before that, we have hints of it. You're saying that there might not have been a reason to dispute it, and that's something I want to ask. Is there any competing tradition attributing these Gospels to anyone else?
Not until the 4th century. Then we start getting some people trying to say that somebody else wrote the Gospel of John. And then by the 5th century or maybe late 4th century, you have Faustus saying that, we don't know who wrote the Gospels. He's the first one to really argue that we don't know who wrote these Gospels. And St. Augustine, refuted him on that and against Faustus. But yeah, you don't really start getting it until after Constantine. But I mean, the early traditions are pretty solid. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
And there's nothing in the historical record that suggests that anyone was arguing about this. It was just sort of everyone just sort of accepted what Irenaeus said and was like, yeah, that's obviously.
Yeah. And, you have Celsus, for example, that Origen responds to. And he says, I could have said many things about Jesus, but I only chose things from your Gospels to wound you with your own words. And the funny thing is he only quotes from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So even Celsus is acknowledging these are the only 4 Gospels we use. Now, he doesn't say that those are the authors, but it's interesting that those are the only ones he's really referring to.
That's interesting. So he only goes to those 4 as sort of the authoritative sources. and which implies, and now Kelsis, what was the date on him again? I can't remember. That's
I
ballpark.
think it's like it's gonna be late second, maybe late second century, I believe.
Late
Is when
second
it
century,
was.
kind
Yeah.
of similar time as Irenaeus, and it would make sense if it was earlier than that. In that time, there isn't a dispute over it, and so if there was a dispute over some of these things, we would expect to find something in the writings dealing with it. But it seems as though once it gets posited, everyone's just sort of like, yeah, we know.
It was just like a known fact, and it didn't become an issue till Marcion tried to sneak in an anonymous gospel. Then they're like, nope, we have to defend this now. It's always been Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, as we've always known. And again, if there were competing traditions, we would have had hints of that. I mean, the church fathers did not have the gift of brevity. They would ramble. They would go after this heretical group, that heretical group. And there were people disputing and saying, no, we think that, Andrew wrote a gospel. Irenaeus would have had a long, long section on that, but he doesn't have to because no one was disputing it.
Got it. Well, let's take a look here at actually a different Bart Urman section. He brings up another point. Let me share this one. Believe it is this one. Hold on. Here it is. Oh no, that's the contradiction. Here it is. All right, let's see what he has to say on this one. This is about Luke.
So I assume there was a Luke, and possibly he was a Gentile. That'd be fine. If that's true, though, that would mean that the Gospel of Luke was not written by an eyewitness. It's identified as Luke to connect it with Paul, just like Mark is not one of the disciples, but he's a companion of Peter. And so when they put the canon together, they chose two books that allegedly were written by disciples of Jesus, Matthew and John, and two that were connected with the two most important apostles, Peter and Paul. Okay, so that would mean, with Luke, we're not dealing with eyewitness testimony for the gospel. So I assume there was a Luke. And,
okay.
Let me pop this one real quick.
Yeah, it's like, well, the answer to that is, well, duh. Like, we've acknowledged it. We argue that's an actual good reason to trust the gospel authorships, attestations, because they're not attributing it to like Peter. Why did he just sort of like made the argument for me? If they were making up titles, why did they attribute it to Matthew, Peter, Paul, and John? Like that would have been perfect.
And he says Paul is one of the most important disciples. I would think that one of the original 12 would have been a more important disciple. Like John is clearly someone who would have been more important, but even the other apostles, like Paul has always, even to this day, is a little bit like, are we sure we should give him the same amount of weight as like the original 12? And then to say, we're going to take his traveling companion and make him the fake author, I don't know. I think it doesn't bear up. But there's one, actually, I think I meant to play that one later. There's another one he says here about the language that they're written in. And I wanted to get your thoughts on this. So I'm going to pull this one up.
Yeah, real quick about the whole eyewitness thing. I mean, like, there's a scholar named Luke Vandeweghe who just wrote a book called Living Footnotes on the Gospel of Luke. And he makes a claim that, like, Luke says he interviewed eyewitnesses. Okay, so on prima facie, we're getting eyewitness testimony here. It's not like Luke is just telling us his traveling notes. He's talking to eyewitnesses. And Luke Vandeweghe notes, if you go through the gospel, you see things like Semitism showing up in places where it's talking about Jesus interacting with people. Meanwhile, if you read the we passages in Acts, the parts where Luke claims to not, where Luke claims to be an eyewitness when he's traveling around with Paul, very few Semitisms, very few. So he's writing in like his own hand by his own experiences. Completely different way he's writing about when he in the Gospel of Luke when he's talking about the information he got from eyewitnesses. Then you see onomastic congruence in Luke's Gospel and Acts that Luke Vandeweghe highlights. Which means the naming pattern in the Gospel of Luke matches the right naming distribution we have from the first century. Luke Vandeweghe notes fictional accounts couldn't do that. Biographies like Josephus, he could get onomastic congruence. Plutarch could get onomastic congruence. Modern novels can't. Ancient novels couldn't.
These are so what you're saying, just to kind of for the layman, is that there are certain types of names out there that were common in that era. For example, if all the characters in a in a story about today were like Jebediah and Zedekiah and like Joanna and all these things that are kind of like, yeah, maybe you had a group of people that had all those names all together in some like really biblical community. But if you just took a random sampling of names, you wouldn't have, like, you can actually take the names used and then apply them to the time period and see, do these line up? You know, like everyone back in the day, like nobody was named Wyatt when I was having my son, at least I thought. And then I found out that everyone at the same time that I was naming my son Wyatt was also naming their son Wyatt. So,
well, I mean, yeah, but think about what you said there with the names Jebediah. Imagine if you're reading this sounds inaccurate, and then you read another paragraph and you're like, oh, this is taking place in Amish country. Now it's going to sound more accurate because those are names the Amish do use to this day. And so, yeah, it'd be very hard to fake that. Even with your example, you may not get the right distribution of Jebediahs. Like maybe there's only like 40% have that name that should show up in your work, but you have it way too much. Like, how does the most popular names at the time were names like Simon and Joseph, and those are the most popular names in the Gospels too. How do they get that? They have the right distribution of names, and that the most popular names are showing up more frequently in the Gospels, and the least popular names are showing up less frequently, and the mid-tier names are showing up the middle amount there. So they have the right naming distribution. You can't get that kind of stuff if you're writing fiction. And Luke Vandeweghe has been running tests, and that's what he's been finding. So the Gospel authors, especially Luke, was clearly talking to eyewitnesses.
Yeah, and let me real quickly go to this clip because it's very relevant to what we're talking about when it comes to the language and some of that's used. So let's get to this.
Disciples. They don't claim to be. The Gospels are written. Your apologists would disagree, but the historical evidence indicates almost certainly. Did Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John write Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? There are very, very good reasons for knowing, really, almost virtually knowing that these were not written by Jesus' disciples. They don't claim to be. The Gospels are written in high-level, very educated literary Greek. How did they learn highly literate Greek? They didn't have adult education in the ancient world. To learn how to compose books took years of training, and it started when you were a young child. And so none of the disciples had that.
Okay, so his claim here is that the gospel writers, or the Gospels are written in high-level Greek, so therefore they couldn't have written them because they were either illiterate fishermen or, you know, his disciples weren't well-educated. What do you say to that?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of issues. I mean, like, I find kind of like the opposite when I'm reading scholars. Like, these were not highly sophisticated biographies. These were pop-level biographies of that. Like, they weren't as sophisticated as, like, what Plutarch was doing, or Josephus, or Suetonius. Like, they were pop-level biographies. So I always find that odd. And then people always complain about Mark's Greek. Like, it's written, like, really rough and hard. Like, it's always written in present tense. And so you have Matthew and Luke try to clean it up. And then you go, okay, fine, Mark, fine, sure. But what about Matthew and Luke? Okay, well, most people in the ancient world didn't write themselves like we do. They hired scribes, trained professionals. And these scribes were not people who were just coming in to just dictate. They would help craft a work, like a letter. Like, what is his name? Cicero talks about his scribe constantly helping him write and draft letters. And Cicero was highly trained and educated, but why is he still using a scribe? I mean, that's just how ancient people wrote. And then, of course, you know, you have the fact that, again, you have the only one we can really contest is John. Okay, because he was just a fisherman, as far as we can tell, or someone who was just a disciple of Jesus.
Yeah, but
Matthew was a tax collector.
Yeah, Matthew would have. I was just thinking, like, as you think about the specifics of his argument, you go, wait a minute here. Matthew was a tax collector, and then Luke and Mark probably were the scribes that you're talking about, who had the education necessary. So it fits exactly with what we'd expect in those three. The only one that you have a question mark on is John. I guess, I mean, so, all right, we've weakened it down to where the only one that plausibly this argument could work on is John, but what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, that's easy to get around, because if you read the Muratorian fragment, it says that when John was called to write, he was with Andrew and a bunch of other brethren, and they fasted, and then they came to the conclusion that John should write. But it's not like this idea that he is going to write. He's probably dictating because he's with a bunch of other Christians there. There probably was at least one scribe there. And so, what's interesting is if you read John, who is like one of the first disciples after John the Baptist, it's Andrew. Andrew just shows up. It's like Andrew was there going, make sure you mention me because, I was there too. And I didn't get a lot of, room in the other gospels. So make sure I get some mention here. I think that's probably what happened. And so what's probably going on is John is dictating, but this is not this idea where he just sits in a corner and tells. This is something that was crafted. It took time. They would talk about how it's going to go. Then they would get a plan together, and then they would start writing these things out. There was a lot of group effort into these. And so, yeah, John could be the main author behind it, but he's going to be working with scribes. I mean, Paul, when he's writing, we see that he opens many of his letters with other authors mentioned. We see at the end of Romans, the scribe, what is it, Tertius, I believe his name, says, I, Tertius, write you this letter. So we know that even Paul, who is highly educated, was not writing his own letters. This was just a common thing. I understand why this is an issue for Bart Urman. I mean, you just look at the cultural context. And he even said this once to a Jesus mythicist. I documented it in my Reliability of the New Testament series like 10 years ago in part 7, where he said to a Jesus mythicist, every ancient author wrote via a scribe. Like, so why is this now a problem when it comes to the Gospels? I don't understand his reasoning.
Yeah, it's actually one of those ones that, to someone who doesn't understand the context, this seems like a really powerful argument. Like, oh man, like they're anonymous? Oh, that's right. They were all fishermen. And then you actually look at the details and you're like, this is a terrible argument. Like, why does Bart keep making it? Which is actually a little bit disappointing to me, because like I can give Bart some credit for certain things, but man, like on this one in particular, like it's just a total flop. Although I want to go, so I want to go to a different one. I actually think probably, as I watched your Gospel Reliability series, probably my favorite video of all of them was the dating of the Gospels. Okay. I recently, I'm a history nerd, and I really love timelines. Because I think once you put events into timelines, all of a sudden it starts to make sense. And so there's that question about, okay, we have these Gospels, right? We say Jesus resurrection happens roughly, let's just say 32 AD. Obviously, there's some dispute about the exact date there. And so it's like, okay, were these written contemporaneously, like as he was alive? Like when were they written? Why were they written? And now, a lot of scholars will point to the year 70 AD and say that the Gospels were written after 70 AD. Because they generally, and I don't know, are you Mark was the first one written? Is that, do you tend to agree with that idea?
Yeah, I tend to just agree with the consensus. I've not seen let's just say I've not seen enough to convince me that the consensus is wrong. I know there's a guy, his channel is Faith Because of Reason. If people are interested, you could go to his channel. He makes a case that Matthew was first. I think it's interesting because I've seen those, and I'm just not convinced. And I think it's simpler, more parsimonious to say Mark was first.
Yeah, and what do you think are maybe some of the top reasons that you and that scholars give to say that they think that Mark came before the others?
I can't remember exactly all of them. For one thing, Mark's Greek is really rough. It makes more sense that Matthew and Luke would want to clean that up versus Mark being able to read Matthew and then going, well, I'm gonna do this in a really rough fashion in terms of Greek. But there's other reasons. Dale Allison and W.D. Davies mentioned a couple in the beginning of their commentary on Matthew as to why Matthew was using Mark.
I see. Okay. So, and that, I would encourage people that can look more into that, but let's just say that that's generally the consensus, even amongst believers, non-believers. It tends to be the view. Now, so then the question becomes, well, when was Mark written? Now, Mark contains prophecies about the destruction of the temple of Jerusalem, all these predictions all about it. And the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem was in 70 AD. So therefore, people say, well, then it must have been written after the destruction of the temple. And
yeah, it's a weird argument. Yeah, it's a weird argument. Because like most scholars recognize that people were predicting the destruction of the temple before 70 AD. Like Josephus mentions another alleged like another prophet named Jesus, actually, who in the 60s was doing it. Then you have the book of Daniel talking about the destruction of the temple. So, like, most scholars, it seems, recognize that's a bad argument, but they're still stuck on the 70 AD date for some reason. Lately, I've seen some saying maybe Mark was like 65 to like 70 AD. So maybe it's around that time. Like, you're seeing the Jewish wars unfolding, so then you start to go, okay, well, let's write this gospel because the temple's about to be destroyed. But it's a really weird argument, and then there's no other reason, as far as I can tell, to date Mark that late.
I agree 100%. That's the exact thing that I found. I was like, okay, so everyone says it's after 70. Like, what's the reason? And every time it comes back to this same thing, and it's just this presupposition that, well, they couldn't have actually predicted that this would have happened. It's just like presuming that there's no such thing as prophecy, and therefore there's no way they predicted it, and therefore it had to have been written after. And I'm just like, that's just presupposing the conclusion that you want to, like, your own worldview, and that these books aren't actually what they claim to be. But there's no reason to think that it has to be before or it is after that. So what do you think are the reasons to think that the Gospels might have been written before 70?
Well, I mean, the biggest reason actually came originally from a skeptic over 100 years ago. His name was Adolf von Harnack. And he originally was dating some of these texts to like the late 1st century. And then he was looking at Acts, and he realized there was something really weird in Acts. It has this big buildup to Paul going to Rome to be on trial before Caesar. And there's all this foreshadowing. You have Paul saying he's going to go. Then Jesus says he's going to go. Then he finally gets his trial, so he's going to go. And then an angel appears to him on a ship and says, you're going to stand before Caesar. Epic foreshadowing. Then he gets to Rome, and then Luke writes, and he lived there a full 2 years at his own expense, and people came and visited him, and the end. It's an enigmatic ending. Like, it doesn't even make sense. Like, this would have been a horrible way to end any work. And so what Harnack said was, like, it probably was written around that time. Like, the trial hadn't occurred yet, because if it did, Luke would have included that in Acts. So we're talking 62, 63 AD, because it's not absence of evidence. It's not like we're just arguing from silence. We're arguing from presence. There's all this foreshadowing of this trial before Caesar, where Paul is going to get to present the gospel to the emperor of the known world. Never happens. That is horrible fiction if that's what you're writing. That's horrible if you're writing after this trial had occurred. So it's probably likely that's when he ended Acts. But that also means he had written the Gospel of Luke prior to that. And if you use Mark as a source, Mark was also written prior to that. So you have Mark, Luke, and Acts all prior to like 63 AD, all right in there. So that's a pretty good case that at least 3 of our New Testament books were written very early on. Then you look at Matthew. Matthew, very similar things. He's talking about how to give proper gifts before the altar at the temple. Why would he include that in his gospel if the temple had been destroyed? So, that's an odd thing as well. So it seems he was writing before the destruction of the temple as well, because he assumes it's still there and still it's able for people to go offer gifts. So it seems as though at least the synoptic gospels and Acts all were before the destruction of the temple.
Yeah, no, I heard those in your series and things, and it was really interesting because when you do read read Acts, just go read it and go read the last part. It's just like all of a sudden it just like stops. It's like this story's just trucking along, all this cool stuff, and then it just ends. And if it was written then, that would have meant it. So here's the other thing that I found as I was thinking about it. I went through kind of the timeline again, and I'm thinking, okay, Jesus' disciples probably are similar in age to him. That's just kind of I think that's a reasonable thing to assume, is that his disciples are probably reasonably close in age to him, which means
probably a little younger.
Yeah. A little younger, maybe. That's fine. Yeah. But regardless, by the time you're getting into, all right, let's go into the 30s. In the 30s, you have literally, it's just the eyewitnesses themselves running around talking amongst the disciples. And then the gospel begins, and it's only in Jerusalem, really. You have all the persecution of the saints in the 30s, and the 40s, but I think it's in the 40s and then into the 50s. That's the time when the gospel begins to go, or the story of Jesus really starts to expand more broadly outside of Jerusalem and outside of those areas, right? Not only this, also, and so as it would expand, I was thinking of it this way: as it expands, there's less and less eyewitnesses that you can just go talk to, right?
Mm-hmm.
It used to be, it's like, well, oh, you want to hear the story of Jesus? Well, come on over to, Peter's house. We'll talk about it. Now you're
Right.
getting to where this thing is expanding and growing. And then as it expands and grows, you have people now that are going out to teach who aren't eyewitnesses. And you're going into cultures that are Greek cultures. And so the need would have arisen in that time frame of about the 50s, I would say, which is where I think they were most likely written. And the disciples are beginning to get older. There probably was also a recognition, at least in my mind, this is just my sort of conjecture as I'm thinking about how this might have played out. Okay, we're spreading the gospel far, far away. The disciples are starting to get older. We probably need to get this stuff written down so as we continue to expand this work that it'd come about. And that all seems to line up with the ending of Luke, the stuff that you're talking about, the Jerusalem temple. But the other side, their only argument is, yeah, but it predicted that it was going to be destroyed, and we know that couldn't have been. So we just had to presume that these weren't real prophecies and say it happened after, which I think is like, it puts them in a really bad spot, because the actual evidence, if you just look at it, seems to indicate that they're prior to 70. But
Yeah. I mean, you look at other things, like they're very nice to the Romans. Like the Roman centurion is super nice to Jesus on the cross. Like he's like, oh yeah, he must have been the Son of God. You have a Roman centurion having more faith than anyone in Israel. I think that if these Gospels were written after 70 AD, they probably would have left those stories out. I mean, I'm not saying they didn't happen. I'm just saying they probably would have been like, let's not write that one down. The Romans have been kind of mean to us. We'll skip over that part. And we see like the book of Revelation, which is probably written either like in the 90s or, during the Neronian persecution. They're very harsh on Rome. They don't like Rome anymore all of a sudden. So we see that start showing up in the Christian writings. So yeah, there's all these indications that these are definitely early, at least the synoptics.
yeah, and I think that's one of the really interesting things about it, because a lot of people don't realize this. The bad guys in the story prior to 70, or really prior to like the 60s, the bad guys were the Jews. The Jews were the ones persecuting the Christians in Jerusalem. They were the ones who just killed Jesus. Like, they were the bad guys in the story. Yet in the gospel, and then after 70 AD, the Romans are the ones who are going after the Christians. Mm-hmm. So when you look at it, anyone knows this, read the Gospels. Who's the bad guy? I mean, Pilate himself is like given a pass, and it's the Jews that are blamed for everything. And so it would make more sense in that context. Again, even if it was a fiction, that they would have been writing about the Romans being the bad guy. But for some reason, the Romans play this like weirdly like not bad guy role, which is funny. So anyway, I think that's a great point. Any other thoughts on dating?
No, I think that's good. If you want to see more, you can check out the series. But those are going to be the main points I think we've hit here today.
Perfect. Now, here's another one. There is a developing Christology, I think. I think it's fair to assume that the Christology in John is more mature, meaning, and for those who don't know Christology or whatever, Christology means the view of Jesus as God, right? As a fully divine being, at the very least, because Michael and I may have some differences on our own Christologies.
Yeah.
But regardless, we can say, just looking at the New Testament writings, that in the Gospel of John, it's very, very like Jesus is God. You have the I am statements, and all of that. In Mark, that's much more tame. And so people like, maybe Alex O'Connor or Bart Urman, they'll say, look, Jesus never claimed to be God. And we can see in the Gospels, as you get to the latest Gospel, that by that one, it's like Jesus is God. But in the earlier ones, it's more like he's this messenger from God. Now, obviously, we can debate the Christology side of it, but I want to focus more on this development in Christology, which seems to be there in the text, regardless of your own Christology. What are your thoughts on the development of a more fleshed out Christology as you go on through the Gospels?
Yeah, I may push back a little bit on that. I don't know if it's a developed Christology. I just think by the time you get to John, he's just like, no, let me tell you it as plainly as possible that he is God. This is the same thing Mark was saying. This is the same thing Luke and Matthew were saying. I'm just going to be explicit about it as much as I possibly can be so that flat out we are saying Jesus is God. Because, in Mark, you have Jesus saying things like the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath in Mark 2:28. I mean, who's Lord of the Sabbath? None other than God. He's the one who gave the Sabbath to the Israelites. He is the Lord of the Sabbath. To claim to be the Lord of the Sabbath is to claim to be on par with the Father, aka God. Mark opens his gospel by saying, that someone's going to come and prepare the way for Yahweh. Okay, well, who does that? John the Baptist shows up and prepares the way for Jesus. You have these explicit statements. You have Jesus claiming to be the Son of Man, and then we know by the time he gets to his trial, he's claiming to be the Son of Man from Daniel 7, who comes riding on the clouds of heaven. Okay, the only person who does that in the Old Testament, again, is Yahweh. It's God. So I think Mark's Christology is extremely high. In Matthew and Luke, you have Jesus explicitly claiming to be Yahweh, and more scholars are picking up on this, like Jason Staples, Michael Patrick Barber, Charles Quarles as well, Ed Komashevsky, Robert Bowman Jr. pointed this out. But in Luke 6:46 and Matthew 7:21-22, Jesus calls himself Lord, Lord. And you might go, oh, well, he's just adding it for dramatic emphasis. But no one did that. Nobody did that in any Greek text from that time or prior. The only person who ever claimed to be Lord, Lord was Yahweh, because in the Old Testament, you have places in Ezekiel where you have Adonai Yahweh, and that's when that's translated into the Septuagint. They rendered it as Kyrios Kyrios or Kyrie Kyrie, Lord Lord. Who else claims that other than Jesus? Just God. So no one else from that time period or prior in any Greek text that we know of at all ever claims to be Lord Lord. So Jesus is explicitly claiming to be God. And then, of course, it's explicit in John. I think it's all there. I just think that it's more subtle from our perspective in Mark and maybe Matthew and Luke. And John is just like, all right, I'm sick and tired of this subtle. So let's just get to the point. I'm opening my gospel by telling you he is fully divine. He is God. I'm not beating around the bush here. So I think that's just what happens there. I think it's pretty explicit in all the Gospels. It's just that maybe to the untrained eye, you're missing it in Mark and the other two synoptics.
Yeah, and I've heard that a good way to think, well, I guess I'll ask you this, maybe you can answer it. Could it have something to do with the different audiences that the Gospel of John was meant for when compared to the synoptic Gospels and kind of who they were meant for? Do you think that could have something to do with it?
Yeah, I think the synoptics are mainly following the same oral tradition that the church had basically taught. And so that was going to be primarily developed, I would say, in Jerusalem, preaching to Jews. So they're going to rely on just using a lot of Old Testament quotes to show that Jesus is God. And they show this over and over again. By the time you get to John, the church is going to be mostly Gentile. It would make more sense for him to be trying to be more explicit with the Gentile audience. And so I think that's what he's basically trying to do. He's just like, let me just tell you flat out so you don't get any of this wrong anymore.
Yeah. I think that's a good way to put it, because even though the stories in the synoptic gospel are being taken to a Gentile audience in Greek, the stories that they're basing it off are the way that the Jesus story was taught in the oral tradition to the Jewish audience. And so, and I've often heard that John is really writing, to a certain extent, to the church, rather than where the earlier ones are being written like missionary pamphlets, basically, or something like that, at least something akin to that. And that that's a big difference. Like if I'm writing to people who already know the basic story, I'm going to emphasize different things than the people who, you know, and we do that all the time. Like as someone who's been a missionary, like there's a certain level of the story that you kind of give the basics, and then you get more into the theologizing stuff in later sort of discussions where you get into more of the details of the theological, as it were, which kind of seems that's at least what I see as I read the synoptics and I compare them to John. So any other thoughts
Yeah.
on that?
No, I think we've covered it pretty well. I need to do a whole series on the whole Christology of the Gospels. I just haven't had time to get to it.
Cool. Well, let me know when you do that. I'd love to see it. Now, the last part I'll hit on is something where maybe I'll give a little bit of credit to Bart Urman, because, and this is something where you and I probably have some disagreement, and that is, see, a lot of Latter-day Saints don't hold to biblical infallibility or inerrancy. But I also think people got to be careful, because that doesn't mean that we don't believe in biblical reliability, that the Bible is highly, highly reliable. And I think what a lot of Latter-day Saints, what attracts them, is they like to take things that Bart Urman says, where he points to issues in the Bible, and be like, see, it's not infallible, it's not inerrant. But I'm sort of like, you guys, you got to be careful, because Bart doesn't just hold that the Bible is not infallible. He seems to imply, at least, that it's not reliable. And so I want to play a quick clip from Bart talking about this, and then
Well,
get your
real quick, I
Oh,
mean,
yeah, go ahead.
I don't really hold to like the old concept of inerrancy. I'm perfectly fine saying there are, scribal errors in the text. Like I've been kind of on the same page. It's just highly reliable, but that doesn't mean has to be error free. I mean, I follow Mike Licona pretty much on this area.
Interesting. And so, actually, I'm curious about that. So, when you say that there could be, potential errors or things in the Bible that I guess, I mean, what do you mean by that? Because a lot of people, most Christians typically hold to the view of the Bible as the infallible, inerrant Word of God. It sounds like you have a little more nuanced view. Help me understand kind of your view of it.
Yeah, I mean, like there's gonna be, it's hard to get around this kind of stuff. So if you go to like 2 Samuel 21:19, it says there was war with the Philistines at Gob, and Elhanan, the son of Jar-Oregim, the Bethlehemite, struck down Goliath the Gittite, the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. Well, hold on. He didn't strike down Goliath. King David did. Well, we go to 1 Chronicles 25, and there was war with the Philistines, and Elhanan, the son of Jar, struck down Lami, the brother of Goliath the Gittite. Okay, so did he strike down Goliath or Laphmi? Well, most scholars would say that, I don't know if it's most, but the scholars I cited in the past say that in 2 Samuel 21:19, there's some scribal errors here. And it's actually easy to show that happen in the Hebrew. I did a video on it like a year ago or so, and it's just easy to show how the scribe could make errors when you're writing 2 Samuel 21:19 there. So that's probably a scribal error. I don't understand why that would be a problem, because we can actually see how it happens and unfolds. That doesn't mean we don't have reliable accounts and reliable history coming through the biblical text. It just means that over time there have been these tiny things that snuck in. Like there's a place in the Gospels where Jesus is giving instructions, and I think in like one of the Gospels he says, "Don't carry anything, not even a staff." And then in the other Gospel he says, "Carry nothing except a staff." Okay, could they have had a little mix-up on if Jesus said to carry a staff or not? Sure. Is that going to mean he didn't rise from the dead? No. That's the kind of stuff that I'm talking about in terms of like lacking, like these little tiny errors. There are no major errors, though.
And so what would you say? Because I mean, I'll say that's essentially my position. I look at the biblical text and I say, look, I think that the text that we do have is highly reliable to convey what God wanted to convey in those instances. But there are those who will say, well, how can you say it's the Word of God? This is kind of what someone will say to me when I say something like that. How can you say it's the Word of God if human beings are able to corrupt it? Like what's your view? What's your response to that?
Yeah, I mean, so Was it God who led the children of Israel out of Egypt? Yes. Did he worked through a imperfect man named Moses? Okay, Moses made mistakes along the way, obviously. Does that mean that that was not God leading them? No. So, yeah, God works through imperfect people, and sometimes those imperfections come out in the narrative. Likewise, God chose to wrote scripture through imperfect people and have scribes copy it down. Do we have to have God perfectly preserving everything through the scribes up to the ages? I mean, like, I think that'd be kind of absurd. Like, there's no freedom. It's just everything has got to be super controlled. Like, does a scribe have to get taken over by like an angel every time he wants to write? That'd be violating free will in so many ways. So I think the message could be preserved.
Do you think that in the original autographs that those were inerrant?
I tend to say yes. I tend to say the original probably were, yeah.
Okay. Very cool. And so because we don't have the originals, the text that we have today in our modern Bibles, not to use a Latter-day Saint phrase on you, but it is correct insofar, or the Bible is true insofar it has been translated correctly. Is that similar to your position? I don't want to put
maybe
put
I have to think about it. Yeah, I don't know. I have to think about it. I mean, again, I focus on reliability, trustworthiness, the evidence for the resurrection, because like, are we really going to say Christianity is false because the gospel authors mixed up if Jesus said to carry a staff or not? That seems absurd to me. Jesus can still rise from the dead.
And I agree 100%. And I think people who go too far the other direction were like, okay, because there were scribal mix-up, that means basically the whole narrative now can be cast into doubt. I think that's just a way overreaction. And so, it's funny though, like the Quran, for instance, is not this way. The claim of Islam is that literally every letter of the Quran in the Arabic was placed there infallibly, not through Muhammad, but by God, as if God was writing it with his own pen, sort of thing. That's my understanding of the.
It's the uncreated speech of Allah, and that's a problem for them because they have a much stronger claim to defend than Christians have to defend. So I'm always like, well, they will try to thrust those principles on us. Like we have to say the Bible is the uncreated speech of Yahweh. And we don't say that. We say it was inspired by God. So we have a much weaker claim to defend than they do. And that makes it a little bit easier for us. And so that's why they're always trying to thrust their principles and their Islamic ideas onto us so that they can knock down that straw man.
Absolutely. Now, what about the story of the woman taken in adultery? That my understanding is that the earliest manuscripts don't actually have that story in them, and so most scholars believe that is a later insertion into the Gospels. What are we to make of that? I mean, that seems to be more than just a scribal error. What are your thoughts on that story, and if it should be even included in Scripture?
So there's a lot of debate about that. I just had Dan Wallace on my channel recently, and he was talking about this because the Super Chat mentioned it. So it sometimes floats around in Luke, sometimes it floats around in John. It probably was an independent oral tradition that probably happened, and the church liked it so much they were like, man, we just got to get this in somehow. And so they would insert it possibly in Luke, John. Some think Luke may have originally wrote it like as like an addition, like he wrote it like later, and then they were trying to figure out where to put it, and then somehow it found its way into John somehow, because there's a lot of similarities between Luke and John, as scholars have noted. So that could be kind of where it came from. We're not entirely sure. But it definitely was not original, as scholars are aware. But my take is I tend to lean to the idea that it was probably a reliable oral tradition that happened. And then the early church just wanted to find a way to fit it in because they liked it so much and it really reflected the character of Jesus. So ultimately, though, we don't know. It is what it is. It's just one of those things we have to speculate about at the end of the day.
Yeah. And ultimately the Gospels originated from the oral traditions of the eyewitnesses. And so if there was something in that oral tradition that was continuing on after their deaths that hadn't gotten into the Gospels, I wouldn't have any problem with that being inserted and included. If it is, obviously the early church thought it was reliable enough, or at least had enough provenance within the tradition to be able to be maintained. Although I do think that it creates some interesting questions for those who think that everything, like, there's sort of the idea that you can't add to the Bible. And so if somebody in the year, 120 was like, you can't add to the Bible, you can't add to these Gospels, and then this story gets added in later, is that, I don't know, what would your view be on that sort of idea that you can't add to the Bible, and this seems to be an addition to the Bible that was made later?
So that shows up in the book of Revelation, for example. But I mean, it's not like that was the early church. This idea, if anyone adds or takes away from the content of this book,
but it was in Revelation. It's talking about, but in Revelation, it's talking about the book of Revelation. I mean, the Bible hadn't been compiled by that time.
Yeah, I don't think the early church had that rigorous view that we have. They were trying to collect sayings of Jesus. They were trying to get as much reliable information about what the early church taught. And I think for them, when they saw the woman they heard they had the oral tradition of the woman caught in adultery, they thought this is also a reliable tradition. They probably didn't use those exact words, but they were probably, this is also a reliable tradition about Jesus. It should be in our canon so that we're able to teach this as well, because that's what they were focused on. Again, they weren't thinking with Islamic principles, like this is like the eternal speech. They were thinking we need to teach the church effectively what the early church taught, who Jesus was, what he did, what he said. Let's get as much reliable information about him as we can. So I think that was their goal. It was not like this modern goal that, we got to get every single letter right. No, they were mostly an oral culture, and you could change the way oral renditions would happen if you thought it'd be more effective in how you were teaching it to your audience.
I see. So they had a little bit more open canon sort of view, because really in that period, the canon hadn't really been fully settled on, right? It was still something that they were trying to sort out.
No, it wasn't settled to the 4th century. Yeah, it wasn't settled to the 4th century. So they were still trying to, there were debates about, should we include this letter of John or should we include Hebrews? I mean, the real thing they were trying to get at is what is sufficient to teach the Christian faith? These are the books that are sufficient, and that's what they settled on.
Got it. Awesome.
Yeah. And also there was the other issue, like they didn't want to use books from like the 2nd century. They had to be close enough to the apostles, like written by one or close to one was also a very important aspect.
I see. Well, any other thoughts? This has been great, Michael. I've really enjoyed this, and I think we've given people a lot to think about. What are your final thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think when people hear a lot of different scholars like Bart Urman, a lot of them, they just sort of make like claims. Yeah, the Gospels aren't reliable. Well, they were not written by eyewitnesses, but they don't really go into a lot of the data to support that. Now, they do a little bit more in their books, but I mean, they never really deal with like arguments from more conservative scholars like Luke Vandewey or Craig Blomberg or like Dan Wallace, for example. A lot of their arguments are sort of like brushed aside. Well, they're coming from conservative Christians, so they're biased. But deal with the actual data. If people like Bart Urman are right. Because there's a lot of data more conservative scholars have put forward that is just not being dealt with from the liberal side. So let's actually see them deal with it if they want to hold to their claims that they constantly put out.
Absolutely. And that's what I've found watching your videos, by the way. I think a lot of times my thing is this. I tell everybody this. I really don't care about your credentials. I care about your arguments, and I expect people with big credentials to be able to make really good arguments. And I've actually been wildly disappointed in Bart Urman when I take the time to actually look at what the other side says to address him. I think the only thing I can give him credit for is, okay, he does a good job at occasionally pointing out, as you're saying, some of these contradictions that are there that maybe would be really difficult for somebody who wants to hold to sort of an Islamic view of biblical inerrancy, where it's like every syllable is penned by God himself. Like, okay, he can do a good job with that. But as far as harming the reliability overall of the narratives, as far as bringing up good arguments for why they should be dated after 70 AD, like, it's really weak stuff. And I'm really appreciative of you for making great videos and great arguments showing why he's wrong.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Yeah. Thanks for having me on.